Dan Rubenstein, slowly but surely, your West Coast identity is being stripped from you.
Oh, how much time do you have, Ty? How much time? You talking about college football-wise or just in life?
I was talking about college football, but life is probably a broader discussion, yeah.
It absolutely is. Yes, no, the Midwest has fully engulfed my spirit. And for better or worse, a lot of ways better, I would argue. But yes, I have been engulfed by the great American Midwest, personally and professionally.
Indeed. Well, welcome back, one and all. Hopefully you've been with us all throughout preview season. We started with the group of 5. We made our way through the ACC, the Big 12, and the SEC last episode. Today marks, I guess, the start of our final 3-parter on our final power conference, and that, of course, is the Big 10, the 18-team Big 10 that, yes, includes Oregon and USC and Washington and UCLA. We're going to get into all of that and much, much more. Not just the storylines, but also give you our contender tiers and how these teams stack up against one another. We're going to do all of that today in part 1. Parts 2 and 3 are going to be more team focused. We're going to split the conference up into 2, 9, and 9. Episodes 2 and 3 are going to go into more detail about each of these teams, what they did in the offseason, what you can expect ahead in 2024. Dan Rubenstein, I believe that's the plan. We still got Notre Dame. We still got some other stuff that we're going to do after we're finished with the Big 10, but that's where things are headed in the immediate future.
Hey, sorry for the quick interruption, but it'd be incredible if you considered subscribing to the Solid Verbal YouTube channel right down below. I mean, if you want, I can put 30 seconds on the clock right now, and we can just run through your Notre Dame preview.
No.
Put it on the clock.
No. The people demand more.
I'll put some Flight of the Bumblebee or some sort of copyright-free music. I don't know if that's out of, I think it is, public domain. Like, I'll get you going, Ty.
I'm sure you will.
Feel great about the secondary. Riley Leonard, we'll see with his injury. Receivers should pop a little bit more. Offensive line, more cohesive. Defensive line should be strong. Oh, we're good.
Today is Big 10 Part 1.
Yeah, buddy.
Mr. Rubenstein.
Call Kenny Loggins, because you're in the danger zone.
The Big 10.
Ooh. Okay. See, I think she nailed that one. She glitched a little with the SEC. I think she's a Big 10 homer. Perhaps our fembot is like a Minnesota grad or something. I don't know.
It's entirely possible. The SEC version that we created with the female robot voice had a little bit too much space between the S and the EC.
The EC. Yeah.
So I had to chop it down, and it did sound like it glitched a little bit, but that's okay. This is an organic show.
Ty, you're a gambling man, yes? At times. You found yourself wagering on sports, hopefully in a legal way. If I said 15.5, if I were setting an over-under of 15.5 for the entirety of the season, how many times I call Will Howard Walker Howard?
Oh, my gosh.
What direction are you going in?
I'd probably go under because I give you credit, but you've done it in the past, and I wouldn't put it past you to do it again.
I'm telling you I'm going to approach that number. And you have to extend grace in my direction.
Is Walker Howard even a thing, though, for Ole Miss at this point?
I'm not that good, Ty. I'm just not that good.
How do you feel about the Big Ten? I
feel great about that.
A lot of change in the Big Ten. 18 teams now. A third of the conference, 6 teams have new coaches. A ton of new coordinators, a ton of incoming transfers. We will do our best to go through a lot of that. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, bigger picture, higher level, storylines that jumped out at you as you were going through this conference.
Well, it's size, right? Essentially, the Big Ten is, you think you told me the Premier League has 20 clubs?
Correct.
So this is just a league. This is not a conference. There are no more divisions. Like, this is an entity unlike any other conference, for better or worse, in college football. So that was the first thing that struck me, that, like, in ways that we could before kind of describe a league, like the West Coast is developing these quarterbacks, and, you know, the Big 12 has these wide open systems, and the air raid, and the SEC for a long time, it was sort of man ball attacks, and the Big 10 similar, right? That you'd have, like, you know, Ron Dane and Anthony Thomas and those types of players. Like, the bigger these conferences get, especially with the Big 10, the less we're able to define them in any singular way. As much as people want to say, like, how are these West Coast teams going to deal with, like, all the beef and physicality at the line of scrimmage? Like, I don't know. Like, there's a lot of these teams that have been playing in this conference that haven't had that or haven't had offense. Like, there are a lot of one-note situations in this conference in a way that there really weren't before. So it's nice that we can't define things, but it also blurs lines in a new way, I guess.
We're used to doing these previews. We've done these previews now for however many years it's been since we started the show back in 2008.
Yeah.
And oftentimes when you get towards the end, you start feeling like the whole exercise is getting a little long in the tooth. You know, it's just rinse, lather, repeat, rinse, lather, repeat. This is not me fishing for sympathy. This is just me being honest with you.
Yeah.
The Big Ten was such a slog to get through because there are so many teams. We split teams up. I've got 9, you've got 9, but we still need to know all 18 to have a part 1 conversation about tiers and storylines and whatnot.
Definitely.
It took forever to go through this conference. Just for me personally, I can't speak for you. It took me longer than ever to go through all of these teams to feel like I was educated and informed enough that I could offer opinions on this episode. They need to make these conferences smaller, if only for the podcasters and content creators
for
among
a
us.
very specific grouping of people.
This is me being selfish, but
yeah.
it's a lot. It's a lot. And if you're just a fan out there, maybe who doesn't have to follow all of the teams the way that we do, I think this can be very dizzying. Not just with 4 teams from the West Coast joining in this new world order of college football, but just in general, an 18-team league. Like you said, it's the Premier League. There is so much to discuss here on these next 3 episodes, this episode and the next 2, I guess, that we're going to do our best to try and keep each episode to an hour, but we can't make any guarantees there. There's just a lot to discuss.
I would argue, and this is purely anecdotal in talking to like Michigan people in my life, Wisconsin people in my life, Illinois people in my life, because that's, again, the Midwest has engulfed me. In talking to them, unless you are a specific team blogger, unless you are a diehard on message boards, unless you are following your team in May, June, July, whatever, and looking at the portal and looking at, whatever, people don't know their own teams in the way that they used to. And whether that's a portal thing, whether that's an NIL thing, whether that's just like got more interested in other sports thing along the way, that I talk to fans of these teams, legit fans who watch every single game, and they're like, yeah, we might have good receivers if like this guy from Youngstown State works out, or this freshman who had 3 catches last year works out. Like, because there is so much change to rosters and systems and coordinators coming in and out, that people have never had less of a handle on their own teams, in my experience, as an expert of not having a handle on teams.
Same.
I feel that vibe from people I speak with who legitimately care about their teams, and that's just the experience I've had with Big Ten people around me.
Oh, I had a conversation yesterday with a close friend of mine who's a big-time USC fan, and perhaps muscle memory, maybe just a slip of the mind, asked, hey, what does the Pac-12 look like this year?
Oh, exactly right.
It looks a lot different, my friend. Trust me on that one. On that note, USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington joining the conference from the Pac-12. We found a lot of very interesting travel situations for these schools that I think we'll get into with a little bit more detail as we get into team previews, but that is certainly a factor that I think could be interesting to follow as this bigger Big Ten season kicks off in 2024. I think the prevailing storyline for me, as I kind of put all these teams up against each other, was just how much each team outside of the top 2, which I consider to be Oregon
Indiana.
Oregon and Ohio State, those 2.
Okay.
Nearly every other team is either dependent on getting big-time quarterback play to buoy their offense, or otherwise has some gigantic question mark about their offense going into this season. A lot of offensive question marks just in general from what I could see. And I think that makes it interesting whenever you've got a fatal flaw or a near fatal flaw for a great number of teams and it's all the same kind of thing. That tends to lead to interesting conversation. I do think Ohio State and Oregon have their own offensive questions, but probably in a different class from the other 16 teams.
Yeah, I mean, we both could have told you that in January after watching Big Ten football in 2023, that there are a ton of offensive questions. And like even the top of the conference last year, just with what Michigan lost and Ohio State having what I think was its worst like points per drive offense in the Ryan Day era and beyond that, that, yeah, this was going to be a conference searching for a lot of offensive answers. I actually joked with our buddy Bill Connolly. I read all of his previews as part of the research with regard to the Big Ten, and the number of different ways that he correctly states that not just Big Ten teams, but everywhere, if this defensive line transfer works out from this small school, if this Youngstown State receiver works out, if this Charlotte tight end works out, if this ODU linebacker works out, they might have something.
Yeah.
Because who's to say on any of this? Everybody's hoping they find the next Khalil Mack or whatever from the MAC, but it's not that easy. And so, yes, I think that offensive question from the top on down, really, just because of the new quarterbacks, a lot of new coordinators, a lot of new skill position talent, obviously people looking for line answers everywhere in this conference. There's a lot to be answered for, and it'll be answered quickly.
We've got 6 new coaches, as I said at the top. Jonathan Smith at Michigan State, Jed Fish at Washington, Deshaun Foster at UCLA, who had an auspicious start to his UCLA tenure at
But you
Big
saw
Ten
he
Media
had
Days.
like a shirt at practice like the next day or 2
He
days
did
later.
steer into it. I appreciate
that said, we're in LA.
I appreciate
which was
that.
his awkward stumbling. So he steered into it. I like that.
We have Kurt Cignetti at Indiana.
Yeah.
And then Sharon Moore, notably at Michigan, promoted from within. Also, David Braun, I'm not going to say promoted from within this year, was last year, was the interim, had a really good season, and they removed the interim label. So it's Smith, Fish, Foster, Cignetti, Moore, and Braun as your 6 newcomers atop their respective programs. Some interesting hires on the coordinator side, of course. I think the headliners are Chip Kelly. Chip Kelly leaving the UCLA head coaching job to take over the offense for Ohio State. Danton Lynn taking over the defense, also leaving UCLA, taking over the defense for USC. Penn State, 2 new coordinators, 2 big-time hires. One, Andy Kotelnicki, comes over from Kansas to run the offense. Tom Allen, the outgoing now coach of Indiana, was relieved of command. He's going to take over the defense and make some tweaks. Iowa going in a different direction at offensive coordinator. Didn't work out with Brian. It did not work out with Brian. Tim Lester is going to be the new offensive coordinator. And then we got just a bunch of other guys here, frankly, that were added to new staffs as new head coaches took over.
We're so silly.
Jed Fish going with the all-name All-Stars with Brennan Carroll, the son of Pete, and Steve Belichick, the son of Bill.
Yes.
Eric Bieniemy going to be running the offense for Deshaun Foster. Who's your guy for Northwestern, the offensive coordinator? How do we want to say
Lujan?
Lujan?
Lujan? I don't know how you pronounce his last name. He's under 30. So when he turns 30, I promise to learn the correct pronunciation of his last name. No, very exciting, hopefully. I mean, I don't know if Northwestern has the talent to be as exciting as his offenses were at South Dakota State. But yes, he is somebody that, like, in deep coaching circles, they're looking forward to seeing. You know, Nate Tice mentioned him on our show. To seeing what he's able to do in Evanston.
Sharon Moore is going with Kirk Campbell at offensive coordinator, promoted from within. And Wink Martindale, picking another one off of the NFL, the Ravens tree, I guess, coming in to run that defense. And we'll talk more about that as we get into Michigan. This is not an all-inclusive list. There are plenty of others. Corey Heatherman running the defense now for Minnesota. Like, I could go through a long list of guys, but we'll get into that more, I promise, as we get into our individual team previews.
Mike Shanahan.
It's Mike Shanahan. Yes, that's going to be running some offense for Kurt Cignetti at Indiana.
Yeah.
And then big-time transfers. Again, it's kind of the name of the game these days. We talked about it a lot on our last 3 episodes with the SEC, but Dylan Gabriel going from Oklahoma to Oregon. Aiden Childs going from Oregon State to Michigan State. Quinshawn Judkins, a big deal. Maybe a bigger deal in the NCAA or college football video game series where he's got a deadly spin move.
Oh, is he ridiculous? That makes sense.
They need to patch it. It's really bad.
Okay.
He is stepping in alongside Travion Henderson in that Ohio State backfield to give them a little bit more pop in the running game. Julian Fleming coming to Penn State. Evan Stewart going to Oregon. Both Jabbar Muhammad and Kobe Savage going into that Oregon defensive backfield. Caleb Downs. How can I wait this long to mention Caleb Downs going from Alabama to that Ohio State defensive backfield as well. Again, not an all-inclusive list. Transfers are the name of the game these days, but those are some of the headliners that I think jumped off the page to me.
Just such Curtis Rourke disrespect. Just
And
such,
Curtis Rourke. And
out
Curtis
and out
Rourke.
Curtis Rourke. I'm sorting out how I feel about Indiana. They're your team in part 2 or part 3, but yes. Yeah, it was a huge season, and I still think the biggest transfer of all was Chip Kelly, UCLA to Ohio State, an interconference head coach to coordinator. Just a very odd situation, but I think could be enormous for the Buckeyes as they look to be the favorite in the conference, and we'll get into contending tiers in a moment. But yeah, a lot of these teams, Ohio State, it's sort of passe and cliche to say that their most important transfers were everybody they convinced to stay in Columbus,
That's true.
right? That they weren't turning pro or they weren't seeking opportunities elsewhere. More of an NIL thing, more of a hopefully belief in what Ryan Day is going to turn around at Ohio State, which is a very specific way of mentioning beating Michigan for the first time in a few years. But yeah, that was an enormous job that was done there. Oregon, of course, brings in a ton. You have the defending champ that we haven't sort of mentioned that they're the defending national champion, Michigan Wolverines. I think it's gone a little bit under the radar just because of Jim Harbaugh leaving and how many, was it 13 players drafted into the NFL from this Michigan team?
I don't have the exact number in front of me, but there's a lot of turnover with that Michigan team for sure.
We've had a lot of repeat national champions in this sport or repeat conference teams in the SEC winning national championships. And for Michigan to win their first in a good long time with a headline head coach and guys who have been around that program forever, nice to see something different in the sport. So, yes, how Michigan enters this new era is a little bit different than some of the other new head coaches because of what they're coming off of.
The way that Vegas sees the Big Ten, for whatever that's worth to you.
Yeah.
3 teams in the conference have an over-under of 10.5. They are Ohio State, Oregon, and Penn State. The next team up is Michigan at 9. The next one after that is Iowa at 8. And then the entirety of the conference is 7.5 and below. Nebraska
Right.
7.5. USC and Wisconsin are 7. Maryland and Washington 6.5. Rutgers 6. Indiana and Illinois 5.5. Minnesota, UCLA, Michigan at 5. Both Purdue and Northwestern at 4.5. There is a lot in that middle class, what I would consider the middle class of the Big Ten. I think a number of those teams are going to go over. Some of them maybe comfortably so. I think it makes it interesting that we've got a grouping of teams that are all kind of waiting to pop and could pop, but we're not sure if they will. Whereas we obviously have some stratification at the top with some of those contenders. We know what to expect there. More often than not, as I was looking through the research material, a lot of shrug emojis, to be honest with you. Do I have a shrug emoji? I do have a shrug emoji
You
tier
can just say
here.
a lot of shrugging on my part. Yeah. You're like, oh.
A lot of if this works, great, to your point of what Bill Connolly said earlier. If this works, great. If not, it was worth an effort. So is it fairly obvious to you that the top 2 teams in this conference, as we record this in early August, are Ohio State and Oregon?
Yes. I think that is the most obvious statement that can be made about the Big Ten today, that those 2 teams right now, because in this time, during this time of year, it's not necessarily what they have, it's what are the questions, and they have the fewest questions.
I would agree with
me.
that. I would absolutely agree with that. I look
The
through
fewest major questions, I would say.
obviously we look through 18 teams here, and I try to view it through that lens of questions.
Yeah.
The biggest question, frankly, that I had about both was on the injury side of things. I know that Ohio State has gone crazy in the portal, as has Oregon. Oregon probably to a greater degree. My biggest question about both of these teams is if Dylan Gabriel goes down, what's it look like behind him with Dante Moore? If Will Howard doesn't work out or gets hurt, what does it look like behind him? We know they've got an overflowing quarterback room. But still, can you make an assumption that he can hand that baton off and Ohio State's offense is going to be just as good? Those 2 teams, though, even in the event that an injury does occur at a big position like quarterback, both of them with their offenses and the supporting cast that they have wrapped around them feels to me like they're relatively injury proof. It may not be quite as high level if a big guy goes down, but even still, they're going to play at a pretty high level given the talent around.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And that to me isn't like the biggest question for Oregon. You know, what happens if Dylan Gabriel gets hurt, just because they're advantaged in a way that not a lot of programs are, having Dante Moore as the backup quarterback, you know, a 5-star quarterback a year ago with pretty extensive starting experience already at UCLA. Whatever, you know, mixed results. But yes, those are nitpicky questions, which speaks to your broader point that, you know, these are the teams with the fewest questions. And, you know, you can look at Ohio State and say, you know, how are they finally going to solve the Michigan problem? And you can look at Ohio State and say, you know, which direction, where is Ryan Day's head at after, you know, finding himself under new kinds of pressure that Urban Meyer never really had to deal with, that Ryan Day didn't have to deal with early on in his tenure. And it's just like more of a mentality for Ohio State than any specific position group or player. I mean, the question not Walker Howard, Will Howard of, you know, what was it from last year that can be improved upon just by being surrounded by better players? Sure. But yeah, these are two teams that you're just like, you really have to squint to find serious concerns.
Who's your next tier down?
So I have another team on my first tier.
Oh.
I think Ohio State and Oregon are above this team on this tier, but I have Michigan on this same tier.
Really?
I do. I have Michigan on this tier because I can't put them in, unless I'm going to say I'll put a team on its own tier, which I don't know, kind of feels wrong, kind of feels counterintuitive to the idea of tiers that we're grouping teams together. At least I'm about to contradict myself. I have Michigan on this top tier beneath those two teams, then I have Penn State on their own tier.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I felt weird about it with Michigan just because of what they return on defense, and that we have to give them somewhat of a benefit of the doubt that they will figure things out on offense, even with what they replace and even with the enormous questions there, that they've won games and beaten everybody beneath what I perceive to be them. I'm putting them on this tier. I'm putting Penn State on the next tier down, because otherwise I would have to put Ohio State, Oregon, Michigan alone, Penn State alone.
Right.
So I chose Penn State to be my one solo team, if that's any way to talking myself into this recent contradiction. So I have Michigan there just because of that. I think the defense can be championship caliber.
I have a tier here that I labeled "We'll find a way to go 10-2."
Yeah.
I'm feeling another 10-2 year for Penn State.
Okay.
I'm feeling an 8-4 year for Michigan, but I could still see them going 10-2 because of all the reasons you described.
Yeah.
I think Michigan's defense is going to be championship caliber. I am unclear as to what that quarterback situation is going to look like with Alex Orji, trying to throw the football. He was their running quarterback a year ago.
Who hasn't been named starter yet.
Has not been named starter yet. May not be the starter. There's a lot that I think we need to know before we can make any hard and fast conclusions about the Michigan Wolverines this year. But to some extent, yes, you want to give them the benefit of the doubt. I have some real questions, though, about offense, and especially if it is Alex Orji. We know he can run, but can he throw? I don't know. I'd like to see a little bit of him and what he can do through the air before I start putting Michigan on this pedestal. But I still think there's enough there that they could go 10-2. I'm just not confident they will.
Yeah. No, I think I have Michigan on this tier just because if we're to assume whatever average results from this offense, that they're fine, but take a step back and take some time getting used to along the offensive line and finding playmakers out wide, whatever. But the defense is going to look like we think it's going to look. I feel like they have a really good shot to beat both Ohio State and Oregon. Not maybe both, but either of those teams hosting Oregon and traveling to Columbus. And so if I feel like this team has a good shot to beat one of the top tier teams, quote unquote, I think I should put them on that tier.
Fair enough. So we've got Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State, and Michigan in no particular order in our lead pack.
Yeah, well, I have Penn State a tier down.
Penn State a tier down, but still the lead pack.
Yes.
So to speak.
Yes.
Top two tiers. I have a tier here labeled "Will be funny if they stink," and I have USC in it.
Oh man, Ty. This is the time of year where we're supposed to be like rose-colored glasses.
I'm not saying they will stink.
Okay.
I'm saying it will be funny.
that they just keep not being able to figure it out?
If they can't figure out defense, that'd be the funny part. I think it's obvious that they have to take a step back on offense. They're losing a generational quarterback in Caleb Williams. It's expected that they're not going to get the same level of production out of Miller Moss or Jada Mayava or anybody, right?
So is this the name of your tier, or you just think USC is the funniest team if they fail?
This is the name of my tier. Will be funny if they stink. I have them a rung down, like fifth in the conference.
Same.
But I've labeled it will be funny if they stink, and it will be funny if the defense doesn't improve. Now, I like Dan Lynn. I think that was a great hire. And I think they should be better along the defensive line. So I'm still going to keep the faith that USC is in a good spot here, generally speaking. The schedule does them no favors. This is a very, very difficult schedule for USC that we'll get into as we get into team previews. But I've got USC right now fifth.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, look, it's very hard to imagine a universe in which this USC defense gets worse. It's very difficult to see. They were so bad last year and the year before that they've been making efforts. They overhaul the staff that it would take, and it's probably a more difficult schedule. They played some tough offensive teams last year. It would be kind of a preposterous situation for USC's defense to get worse and not improve to some more respectable point.
Do you have USC in that same position?
Yeah. Here's something that I wasn't fully prepared to not make peace with, because I don't care. But USC probably has the third best receiving core in this conference, and there's pretty clear separation after you get through these first few teams where you're just like, who has, like, I think Washington has a couple good receivers, but after that you're like, who has like a grouping of scary receivers? And after you are in that like 4 or 5 range in this conference, there's not basically anybody. Individual talents, individual tight end here, individual, receiver there, that's scary. But in terms of 4 or 5 guys that could be and could develop into game breakers, that's something to me with USC, given Lincoln Riley's history, given that we think quarterback will always under Lincoln Riley be at least good. Maybe not great, maybe not Heisman level, but the baseline should be good in a Lincoln Riley offense, that they should win a bunch of games based on that. Yeah. And didn't always last year, but given this schedule, given how many points it takes sometimes to win games in the Big Ten, I think they're going to be all right.
I do wonder if by losing Caleb Williams, it forces that offense to be a little bit more balanced and not put it all on the quarterback.
Sure.
I don't know if schematically that's even something they can put together with the personnel, but I don't think Miller Moss is going to be able to lift the entire offense the way that Caleb Williams did for 2 years.
No, I think that's a fair point. And even last year, their record should have been worse last year. Who they played early on in that schedule and at times struggled with Colorado, ASU, Stanford, it could have been even worse with Caleb Williams. So I weirdly think Miller Moss this year is likely in a better position than Caleb Williams was last year, albeit now against what should be facing more difficult defenses. I
had to twist my mind in a pretzel to arrive at the same conclusion, but I did as well in going through and looking at USC. I kind of feel similarly. We'll get into that.
Yeah.
Is there anybody else in your third tier of the Big Ten, or should we go down to the next?
I have 5 teams in my third tier.
Okay, so USC and then 4 others?
Yes.
Okay, who else?
It's a bunch of teams. I don't have a good name. Like you're good at your tier names, but this is my tier of we'll likely do one thing really well, and then the other side of the ball could vary from week to week.
So these are your half teams.
Half team potential, right? And I don't think it's going to be full season half teams, but I think you can have random week 7 disappearances on this list of teams. So I have Washington, USC, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Maryland.
Oh, wow. We're going to have different tiers, Dan, are we not?
I know. I feel like we are.
Different tiers. Washington's interesting to put in this tier.
Yes.
Because Washington is nearly completely rebooting its offense. The only 2 quote-unquote starters that are back on Washington's offense are from other teams. Nobody from last year's Washington offense is
correct.
Back. And it's better on defense. There's only 2 guys who started on this team's defense last year who are returning. There are 2 other starters returning from other teams. But beyond that, 7 new guys. So there's a lot new at Washington, not the least of which is the coach. I'm surprised you have them this high.
Okay, so what I tried to do with Washington specifically is say I'm not going to compare this year's roster to last year's roster. I'm just going to say because of the number of dudes who were rotation guys for Washington, played for Arizona, transfer in, like how do I feel about Jed Fish, who we know should do a good job growing a team from not from scratch because, you know, there's still a culture of winning at Washington recently and there are rotation dudes who have been there and the successful players that he brought in from Arizona. You know, I don't feel great about these coordinators, but if you're saying, okay, you're starting out with what should be a pretty good quarterback in Will Rogers in a good offensive system. Again, we're going to go deeper of Washington another episode. But if I'm taking this roster and I'm taking that I feel like these are higher level Big Ten caliber players at specific positions, not everywhere. Like, I still think there's a lot of work to do on the lines, which, you know, Washington I think they won the Joe Moore Award last year on the offensive line. But skill talent-wise, that we saw development of receivers and running backs, Jonah Coleman being one of them. He's on this roster. You know, he's a thicker, like 5'9", 220 type guy. That if I'm asked to feel better about Washington or a pre-existing Big Ten team that's had a coach, but like we know their obvious struggles, I think there is something about taking a swing on Jed Fish's recent history and some of these parts that I do like. And they're far away from everything. Everybody's going to have to travel a ways to get there. And they're going to have their own, you know, road situations as well. I don't know. I think they're fine. Like, I don't think they're below any of the, like, the other teams I mentioned, like, have, like, very specific, huge questions that I'm not sure Washington does in this moment.
I just had Washington in my shrug emoji tier.
Okay.
And they're in there with UCLA, two teams I genuinely have no idea what to expect out of them. Washington, because of the turnover, both obviously have new coaches and new setups altogether. I don't know. I could see Washington being in this tier very easily. I'm not counting on that, though, because turnover plus the travel plus the new conference
totally
seems like a lot new to give them that much benefit of the doubt. I do like Jed Fish as a coach. I know I joke about him, and I'm still somewhat convinced that the second he can go to Florida, he will.
Yeah.
But he's at Washington now. And so we have to treat it somewhat in a vacuum. He's a good coach. Look at what he did at Arizona. He knows how to build a team up. And I think he'll build this team up. I don't think Washington's going to be bad at all. It's just how long will it take for this team to mesh and get to know each other because there's just so much unfamiliarity there.
Yeah, I agree. And look, there's also an element to me with Washington that, like, this team wasn't slaughtering Pac-12 teams last year.
No, they weren't.
They played really well in big games, specifically against a team in Oregon that made me feel not so happy. But that was a huge strength of Kalen DeBoer's team, that they were able to get up and win those big moments. But in terms of separating, so I think it's unfair to compare this roster of guys to last year's and just sort of say, like, how do they fit in terms of huge questions? I think line questions are legit, but I don't know. Like I mentioned, Wisconsin? I think offense is still a huge question to me. Pop at receiver, what TVD looks like in this offense. You know, offensive line should be fine, but losing, you know, a potentially like great running back in Braylon Allen. And then Maryland. And I have Maryland here in a good way to me. Like, I still have questions about Maryland. Like, they haven't been able to run the ball. They're replacing their quarterback. But like the faith I have in Mike Locksley to field a 7.5 win team is pretty high. Like, I have to separate a team like Maryland from UCLA, Minnesota, Nebraska, or whatever, just because the results have been more consistent and the performances against the top of the conference have been more consistent. So that's why I separated a team like Maryland from the other teams that I think are nearby.
You had Iowa in here as well?
Yes. We know why Iowa can win games.
So I've got as my next tier down. You're higher on some teams than I am. I had 8 tiers. I mean, it's too many. But there's too many teams, like I said at the top.
Yeah.
I have a tier that I've labeled, Help Me QB1 Kenobi, You're Our Only Hope.
Ooh. Teams putting all their chips in that.
Iowa, I think to some extent belongs in that category. Nebraska, obviously belongs in that category. Minnesota very much belongs in that category this year. 3 teams, there are others. 3 teams in particular, though, that are highly dependent on quarterback play. Offense more broadly, but specifically quarterback play.
New quarterback play, specifically.
To move, well, not so much for Iowa. They had Cade McNamara last year.
And he's effectively a new quarterback because he played like 3.5 games. Yeah.
But for sure, Dylan Raiola, Max Brosmer, they need to get quarterback play out of those guys in order to move things forward at Nebraska and Minnesota. And frankly, I think they could. I think there's a lot of potential there in both cases. But anytime you're looking at this from afar in early August and you see that one glaring thing that you need to pop in order for good things to come, it does leave you feeling a little bit uncertain. I think fans of those teams would agree as well. You know kind of what needs to get better, and we'll just have to wait and see whether or not it does. I have below that QB1 tier, broadly a category that I said don't sleep on. Don't sleep on Wisconsin this year. We have a lot of faith in Luke Fickell. Could TVD come back and have a renaissance with the Badgers? I don't know. Remains to be seen. I like Rutgers a lot. I have Rutgers in this category as well. I am way higher on Rutgers in 2024 than I ever thought possible. I really like this team. I really genuinely like this team. I think there's a lot that I can underline and underscore as we go through and talk about Rutgers specifically. But the schedule sets up pretty well for them. It's the easiest schedule in all the Big Ten. A weird travel situation for teams like Washington that have to travel cross country to get there. Rutgers is going to play a very specific style of ground and pound football that I think could be tough for others in this conference to contend with. I like this team a lot. So don't sleep on Rutgers. Don't sleep on Wisconsin. I already mentioned that I've got a shrug emoji tier, which consists of Washington and UCLA, which I didn't know where to put that tier, honestly. I put it below don't sleep on, but I don't think it really matters. Both those teams are free agents.
Okay.
And I had Maryland way down in my bad but spicy tier.
Really?
Alongside Indiana and Illinois.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know.
Illinois did beat them last year. Yeah.
They did. I have no idea why you're higher on Maryland this year.
Why I'm high on Maryland this year?
I mean, it's good news, bad news, right? The good news is that the front seven should be pretty good. They also miss both Ohio State and Michigan on the schedule. The bad news is that the offense is basically starting over, and the offensive line, I think, is going to be a tire fire, at least to start the year.
Sure.
I don't think that's a good formula. Now, I like Mike Locksley, and I think generally he's been good at getting talent in the door, but I'm inclined to go, what did I say, 6.5? I'm inclined to go under.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Maryland has the hallmark of a team this year that starts 6-0 and then finishes 0-6.
I think they have star power potential at receiver.
I do like their receivers. Their receivers are fine.
Yeah.
But the line thing is just, that skis me out. It's really.
I mean, their line has always been kind of disappointing, and they still win
but
games.
This year it's entirely new. So
I don't know. I mean, I think what they have at quarterback was MJ Morris or Billy Edwards. I don't think they've named a guy yet.
It looks that way, yeah. Or Cameron Edge he's in the mix as well.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like Talia developed there. I think MJ Morris, if he's the guy, or Billy Edwards, didn't have a great bowl game, I don't think. But at least throwing the ball. I just think they develop quarterbacks, they develop receivers. The running game has been kind of awful lately. But I don't know, experienced defense and ability to get a quarterback going, I'm not totally out on Maryland. They continually give it to good teams and miss Michigan and Ohio State. That's okay.
I'm fully out on.
Is there anybody you're like just fully tingly about?
Minnesota.
That's like from the bottom half of the perceived bottom half of the conference. Minnesota. Okay, why Minnesota?
I like what they've got back on defense. They're individual contributors for sure.
Lost the coordinator, Joe Rossi.
Lost the coordinator, but I'm okay with that. They need to get better at stopping the run. Most Minnesota fans look at that and they'll call that out immediately.
Right.
But I think there are individual contributors in the skill groups that leave me feeling optimistic. I think they need another weapon to step up, and I think they need their transfer quarterback to pop. But all things considered, I like where that team's at. And I saw the over-under, and I said I'm going over on Minnesota.
Okay.
I have a lot to say about Minnesota when we get to Minnesota. I put a lot of time in on the Golden Gophers this year. They're one of those teams. Also Rutgers, like I said it before, but I think Rutgers is going to be pretty damn good. That's not to say they're going to win the conference or win 9 games, but I think they're going to give teams fits this year with the style of offense they play, with how they have gradually improved under Greg Schiano. I think Rutgers is going to be a very, very interesting story to follow this season.
I'm in on Indiana.
Are you? So
and they were one of my teams.
I have them in bad but spicy, but I did include spicy because I like Indiana. There are reasons to like Indiana. I don't know how optimistic is too optimistic for a team with a new coach and so much new, but Kurt Cignetti saying all the right stuff, brought 13 guys over from James Madison?
Yeah, especially big guys on defense up front. Yeah.
Big guys on defense. Coordinators came with them. It's a lot of that same formula that worked at JMU that I think he's trying to bring to Indiana now. And Curtis Rourke, it goes without saying, we've been a big fan of the Rourke quarterback dynasty forever here on this show. So if he comes in and can give him a little bit more pop at the quarterback position, maybe we're talking about something interesting, especially given their wide receiver room, which looks to be really deep.
I was going to say, Devin McCulley, is that Donovan McCulley?
Donovan McCulley, yeah.
Donovan McCulley, excuse me. He's back. He entered the portal and decided to return.
Correct.
You look at Indiana last year, I know different roster and the portal everywhere. If you just upgraded Brendan Sorsby to what I think is an upgrade in Curtis Rourke, are they winning 3.5 more games? Like, what is the number? They lose their last 3 games by 10 points, all winnable. Michigan State, Purdue, Illinois. So 3 and 4 point losses. If you remember, they gave Penn State a bunch last year, right? They were hitting a couple big passes. If we're to believe that Kurt Cignetti is, and I like Tom Allen. I like Tom Allen as a head coach too, by the way. I think he's going to catch on probably after succeeding at Penn State. That I think there's a little bit of fire and spark to Indiana right now. And maybe I am just reacting emotionally to me being in love with what Kurt Cignetti did immediately upon getting to Bloomington.
Going on the basketball court.
F you, you're cool. F you, I'm out. I love that. So I don't know. There is something, and I like that, the JMU players followed him, as, horrible as it is to say for people who are James Madison fans, that he resonated with them and they felt like they had a good opportunity to keep going with him. That I think they are not bad but spicy. I think they are flawed but spicy.
Flawed but spicy? Okay, I'm going to change this to flawed but spicy. Because
I think there's something there with Indiana.
We're trying to offer hope here on our preseason shows, yes.
Indiana also occupies, every year there's somebody who you're like, yeah, they're going to go 4-8. And then you look up at the end of November and you're like, they're 7-3? What? What's happening now? Somebody's going to occupy that space. And that it's a different type of year with how deep and how big these conferences are, that we're going to have early November conversations that are like, they're 5-4, but they're actually good. You just got to trust me on this, right? That records mean so many different things now. Indiana could be that team that players and coaches maybe look past on a schedule because you're just like, oh, it's Indiana. We have Indiana, but it's between Michigan and Penn State, and we'll figure out Indiana. That's fine. And then you look up at the scoreboard and they're down 17 in the second half. I think they could be that team that is overlooked too much. Still flawed, but I'm curious about them.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of Illinois. I had them in this tier as well. And my overall impression of this team was Luke Altmaier coming back at quarterback. The offense, needs to find a bit of a running game.
Yeah.
But beyond that, the offense just needs to do enough in the early part of the season to overcompensate for a defense that I think is going to take a bit to find its way. And for me, that's a danger zone type thing.
Thank you.
When you look at who is on the early part of the schedule, if you assume it's going to take 3, 4, 5 weeks to get into the flow of things, Kansas in week 2, we know they know how to score. I think Nebraska is going to be much better on offense this year with a better quarterback, and Penn State at the end of September, another offense that, of course, had its warts. We can talk about that on an upcoming episode.
Yeah,
but still should be pretty good by the time all is said and done. And oh, by the way, as the year goes on for Illinois, they've got Michigan in that ground attack. They go to Oregon to square off against your Ducks. At the end of the year, they go to my Rutgers Scarlet Knights to square off against that rushing attack. There are things that Minnesota is also on the schedule a week after Oregon. I don't see it getting much easier for Illinois, even if they do figure out defense. So I've got them pretty low in my tier ranking.
Yeah, I think they're just going to go as Luke Altmaier goes, because I think the position groups that needed upgrading, they were very quietly spenders in the portal space with Zachary Franklin and Terrence Brooks, who started a bunch of games for Texas at corner last year. So they've plugged in holes. Defensive line they were strong at last year, and they lose a couple key guys. If Luke Altmaier is a true dual threat, he doesn't have to be excellent for this team to be good. But if he's a little more careful with the ball, if, like you mentioned, finding a running game, they've got a big dude who I think is promising, and I think it's Caden Fegan. They will be interesting. They have the opportunity to sort of be that Burt Ball team once again.
Okay. My final tier is Northwestern, Michigan State, and Purdue.
Okay.
And I labeled it one of these teams will surprise us.
Okay.
I don't know which one. I hope it's Northwestern and the portable field.
Mm-hmm.
That would make for a cool story. So Northwestern, for those who are just tuning back in, renovating their stadium, didn't have another place to play. As such, decided they're going to build a portable 15,000-seat stadium that you have described as being, 20 feet from Lake Michigan?
If that. It could be 14 and a half feet from the water.
It is right on the water, literally right on the water.
There's a narrow walking path right there, and then it's just rocks and water.
Tickets will be hard to come by. The wind in the kicking game could also be quite interesting to follow throughout the course of that Chicago winter. But Northwestern won 8 games a year ago. Northwestern brings back David Braun. I don't have any sky-high expectations for what this team looks like in 2024, but did it once, stands to reason, okay, maybe he can do it again. Rooting for Northwestern. Rooting for Michigan State. It was a rough year last year for Michigan State. With everything that went down before the season, losing the coach. Obviously now they've got Jonathan Smith in there, who did an awesome job building Oregon State back up, brought some talent in, namely Aiden Childs, who I mentioned earlier. I don't have any lofty expectations for Sparty right now, but I do have a lot of expectations for this coach. I know what he's made of. We've seen him do it before. I think before long, he will build that program up. It may start this year with defense, but for sure, Jonathan Smith is a good coach, and it was a good get for Michigan State. So I like that. And Purdue has a lot of holes to fill. I am not fully out on Ryan Walters. I think he says a lot of the right stuff, and I think his approach to the portal and how he's using it and wants to use it, all of that stuff is very, very smart. Yeah. But this is still a team that is not there. They're going to need some seasoning. They lost like their best player on offense, arguably their best player on offense, as well as their best player on defense in the transfer portal. It's just, you can't kind of make up for that overnight with just a random transfer from a group of 5 school. It just doesn't work like that.
I'm interested in Purdue. I think the defense is going to take a step forward. The defense was quietly decent last year, and it was like 7 different seasons in one for Purdue last year, which is to be expected sometimes when, new head coach, transfer quarterback coming in. But yes, offensively, they have a ways to go. But if their building block is a decent amount of star intrigue on defense and another year of quarterback experience with Hudson Card, I don't think they're going to have a great offense, but they could reach that point where they become a team that if you don't score 24 against, you might lose, right? That I think the defense can get them I don't know what their schedule is. I think it's a really difficult schedule.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think they're going to be one of those teams that maybe doesn't make a bowl, but beats somebody perceived to be way better.
I could see it. I think they're a couple years away, and I think they're in the process of a full reboot. The Purdue schedule is absurd, by the way. It's Notre Dame, it's at Ohio State, it's Penn State. It's a good home slate, but bad for a team that I believe is still in rebuilding mode.
Yeah. I have Michigan State and Purdue probably occupying the bottom of my final tier, just because I think there's a ways to go personnel-wise with Michigan State, as much as I like Aiden Childs, and I think they're going to be able to find offensive linemen in the Midwest. They've got a great offensive line coach. I really like the Joe Rossi hire. I like all these things. It's just going to be a locker room thing, and by that I mean finding people to occupy the locker room. I think it's a quality thing with Michigan State that it's going to take. And you can do it quickly, and we saw how aggressive Jonathan Smith was and had the support at Oregon State to find players to plug in. It's going to take a minute at Michigan State. Purdue, it's more of the schedule than anything else. I think Rutgers is going to be solid. I think your points about Scarlet Knights are salient ones. I think there's a lot of quality in this conference, just because we're talking about power conferences and we said this and we've talked about this before, like a lot of these teams are shoppers. They can fill in gaps with quality players from lower conferences. Yep. And it's not a great thing for the sport, but the reality is if you can find a great edge rusher from Old Dominion or something to come in and immediately replace somebody who was a 3-year starter and is at least of quality, has, value over replacement player, the VORP is high, then you have the opportunity to be like, I think we're going to see the bottom of these power conferences be devoid of catastrophic teams. Unless the coaching hire is truly awful and like doesn't care and is not aggressive as a recruiter, or the team has no support, like in these power conferences, I think you're going to see a lot more like 4 and 8s at the bottom of a conference than 1 and 11.
Hey, that's a really good point. And I felt similarly looking through this. It doesn't feel like there are any total catastrophes. And the ones that may exist are understandable. It's not just going to happen out of nowhere. At least it shouldn't. You would understand if Michigan State had a bad season this year. That would make sense. I've got Ohio State over Oregon.
Okay.
In my Big Ten championship. I think those two teams are the cream of the crop. I think they rise to the top. I think both of them have more talent than almost anybody else in the conference. Both those teams are not in the playoffs. Something has gone horribly wrong.
Sure.
How do you feel as an Oregon guy? Are you going to pick Oregon over Ohio State just to be different?
I'm going to pick Oregon over Ohio State just to be different. I think there is something about year 3, Dan Lanning, where this program is in terms of depth, how aggressive they were able to plug holes, like the secondary was obviously the issue last year against Washington, an injured secondary and a pass rush. I think it just only gets stronger. They lose key guys up front on defense. They find, what I think are more than capable transfers to come in from big programs. I think they have a ton of speed and depth on offense. The offensive line, I think, is going to be in very good shape. And they're also not playing with the same pressure that I think Ryan Day and Ohio State are playing under. Like, this isn't the end-all be-all year for Oregon.
No.
Whereas I do get that sense for Ohio State. And maybe it works out. It was that for Michigan last year, and it worked out.
Yeah.
But with what Oregon's schedule is, the Michigan game in Ann Arbor will be tough, as is on the road against Wisconsin. But getting Ohio State at home is a nice thing. There's a lot of quality up front on this Oregon schedule, but I think right now Oregon has the most ways to win. I think Ohio State has the best defense. I wonder about Will Howard and where they are at quarterback. Ohio State still in this moment, as good as they are. Can't wait to watch Jeremiah Smith out wide as a freshman for Ohio State.
Yeah.
But I think Oregon might be a little bit further along.
Not which team gave you the tingles.
Yeah.
The warm fuzzies. But which team do you think is the most interesting team?
The most interesting team?
As you went through all of your teams.
On my side. Because I don't think the most interesting team is on my side, but I'll humor you. Yeah.
Which team to you was the most interesting? Not the best, not the worst, not the team that you're all in or all out on.
Right.
Just genuinely the most interesting storyline.
I think going into this year, I don't think there's a gray area with USC. I think they're either going 10-2 or 5-7. Like, it either works or doesn't. And I don't think it's going to kind of work, right? I think the 2 defensive transfers coming in from Oregon State should be very good at linebacker and safety. I think they're a little bit better at corner. I'm not crazy about the line outside of Bear Alexander, but like they brought in like Vanderbilt's best defensive lineman. Like, sure. I think the floor has been raised, for USC on defense. It either works with this offensive line, which I still have questions about, or it doesn't. I like the receivers. It either works with Miller Moss or it doesn't. Like, I don't think there's any chance Miller Moss is like a BB minus. I either think he's an A minus or a C minus. And so I think they're 10-2 or 5-7. And that to me is fascinating to watch with a team in a new conference.
I think the answer is Iowa for me, honestly.
Okay.
And I didn't expect that, but this is a program that nearly every year pumps out a top caliber defense. They're very good on the defensive side of the ball. The offense has genuinely been a real issue. The more I read on Tim Lester, their new offensive coordinator, the more I liked him. I don't think it's going to look drastically different from an offensive standpoint, but I think it's going to look different enough.
Okay.
You're going to watch Iowa football, and you're going to say, oh, what they're doing, it looks like what a lot of other teams are doing. No oop-de-oop, nothing out of left field. It's just going to be a little bit more modernized. And I think that was a really responsible hire. They don't need to change up to an air raid. They don't. Not only do they not have the personnel for that, but their defense is good enough. Marginal improvement.
Over Kirk Ferentz's dead body. Will Iowa ever run
Marginal
an air raid?
improvement on the offensive side of the ball makes this team so much better.
Sure.
And in addition to that, for as much as we've talked about how some of these teams on the Big Ten West, the old Big Ten West side of the coin, will be hurt by the divisionless structure and the new scheduling and all of that, Iowa's not really there this year. It's coming at some point in the future. This year, it ain't bad.
No.
So if they can reboot that offense a little bit, just get a little bit better, this team is going to be crazy interesting.
Do you think that because we've done this show for as long as we have, that we forget that we have almost identical conversations about a grouping of teams every single August? Do you think that because we have to find things to talk about, that we're like, guys, how can Texas A&M not succeed this year, guys? Come on. How can Iowa not find an average offense this year, guys? Come on.
I know.
And
I know.
We've spoken to Iowa people, and they say the same thing. They're like, yeah, we hope it happens, but like, we've been here before. We've been in this August conversation of like, hey, if the offense is like decent, this could be really interesting.
Well, the caveat's the line. With Iowa, the caveat's the line. And everybody points to the big stats that jump off the page. What was it, 15 points a game last year? They were supposed to get to 25. They didn't get anywhere close to that. And, of course, that's the stuff that you can really sink your teeth into. But the problems at Iowa started a while ago, and they're almost directly related to line play. And the line needs to be better this year than it was last. I'm hopeful that with some new scheme and with some new energy around that offense, that this is a unit that can improve.
Yeah.
But to your point, yeah, we've said that many times over. Oh, it can't get any worse. It got worse. It really did.
I watched, there was an interview, I think, with Kirk Ferentz where he was talking about Iowa's history on offense and how like they've had pretty good offenses, which I'll agree to disagree. But he like mentioned George Kittle, and he was like, this is a place, George Kittle was, and like we've seen his development since coming to Iowa. They didn't throw the ball to George Kittle at Iowa.
No.
George Kittle became George Kittle after leaving Iowa. Yeah. He had plays, but this was not a superstar college tight end. I think I saw something like in his final season, he was like 9th or 10th in terms of catches or targets for Iowa football. So yes, this is an Iowa situation that I think we've grown accustomed to. And eventually things change, right? Eventually we see something new that is unexpected happen. And I think it'll happen with Iowa at some point. I just know we've had this conversation, Ty. Like we can, like I was going to answer when you asked me, like, who's the most fascinating team? To me, it's Penn State. To me, it's Penn State.
Well, see, I'm wearing a Penn State shirt.
I know you are.
Maybe a little biased there. Penn State's interesting for its own reasons, but if I'm trying to be completely unbiased, my first answer would be Iowa.
Because Penn State is what was the mosquito held in Jurassic Park for all like
the amber?
Yeah. Like Penn State is in this like beautiful amber. They can't get out of it. They can't get out of the 10-2 zone, but it's beautiful to look at, right?
Yeah.
And so they're in this place where like there's so much that is going right for Penn State. Like they just evaluate the hell out of defensive players. And now you're going to unleash Abdul Carter on the edge. Holy hell, is that going to be fun and disastrous for opposing offensive lines to watch, right? There's so much to like about Penn State, but they're in that amber, whatever it is. Amber, I think, right?
Amber, it's amber.
Yeah. They're just stuck in this beautiful gold amber where you're like, I don't think James Franklin's beating these excellent teams, but he's not losing to Maryland anytime soon. And so around the edges, what James Franklin is trying to do to break through that amber to me, like, okay, 5-star quarterback. Oh, not working so well. Maybe it was the receiver's fault. Let's hire a new offensive coordinator. Let's bring in all these great running backs. And like, he's just trying to chip away at what can break through that amber, and nothing seems to be doing the job.
We'll see this year.
Am I wrong in any of those characterizations?
Not really. I mean, I have some very specific thoughts as to what went wrong last season.
Okay.
And I don't feel it's quite like he is flailing to figure out what those things are. I think he knows what those things are. And I think the move to get rid of Mike Yurcich to bring in Andy Kotelnicki was a really, really wise decision for reasons that I can elaborate on as we get into the Penn State preview.
Can't wait.
But to the overall point of trying to break through and just not go freaking 10-2 for a change.
Yeah.
I can relate.
Home
and they are
field
interesting.
advantage.
Two new coordinators, a good defense, plenty of skill talent on offense that I hope they will work around and
Sure.
develop more of. Interesting. For sure they're interesting.
Oh, yeah, I think, look, You turn on a game during a whiteout, you're like, this is the center of the universe, right? Like, this should be a team that has won. Yeah, they've won 3 national championships in the last dozen years. Not too shabby. And you're just like, they can't figure it out? Okay. I can't wait to watch Penn State football this year. And I can't wait every year to see if they can break through in some new way.
Write in solidverbal@gmail.com. Let us know your thoughts on the Big Ten.
Yeah.
How do your tiers stack up to ours? TIERS. If you want to write in about the other kind of tiers, you're welcome to do that as well. Purdue fans, Northwestern fans, Michigan State fans, Indiana. But we're here as your shoulder to cry on. But would love to get your feedback on how you think these Big Ten teams stack up. Again, it's a lot of them. It's 18 teams.
Woo.
I don't know. 8 tiers do I have here? I think I have 8 tiers. It doesn't matter. Generally speaking, we're in the same position. Maryland, though, you and I are going to have some chats about Maryland as we get into parts 2 and 3. Again, the deal with this is parts 2 and 3 are going to be individual team previews. We'll talk in a lot more detail about all of these schools and give you more nuanced thoughts on where we think they're headed in 2024. But in the interim, make sure you hit follow or subscribe and tell your friends. If you have yet to leave a star rating or a review on your chosen podcasting platform, Dan and I would appreciate it. It lets other people know that it's a fun show. They're a college football fan that they might enjoy. You can go on out, of course, and watch these episodes on YouTube. We post them out there as well. And if nothing more, verballers.com. Go and check out our Patreon at verballers.com. If you really appreciate what Dan and I are doing and want to further support the podcast, we offer bonus content, ad-free listening, access to a Discord server that is starting really to get riled up.
Oh, yeah.
Get ready for the college football season ahead. We've got college football 25 dynasties that have formed. It's a cool place to hang, so we'd love to have you as part of our Verballerhood in our little corner of the internet, Dan.
Can I give you breaking news?
Oh, please.
I don't know if you have the breaking news sound or you just
Not
want
at
to
the
do it.
ready. No.
Okay.
I took it off the board.
The Big Ten has released, because we're doing this Big Ten, this is part 1 of the Big Ten preview, they have released their new map commercial.
Oh, no.
Where they're soaring over the country and coming down and up and yeah.
Is it like the Game of Thrones intro that probably cost $1 gazillion to create?
I'm watching it right now. It's the same song. I want to live. That thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm looking at the West Coast. They're soaring over the Rockies. Yeah. They just added that West Coast. Same song. There's Chicago popping up. There's Illinois, Purdue, Indiana, Michigan State, Michigan, Ohio State.
Play-by-play here of the trailer. I love it.
It's, Penn State, Maryland. It's great. It's everything you want out of a commercial. It's that, I haven't seen Game of Thrones. So that's what they do. It's like a soar over of a map kind of thing.
Kinda. Yeah, kinda.
Yeah. It's a perfect commercial, and they nailed it. How about that?
All right. Well, part 1 in the books. Parts 2 and 3 yet to come. Hope you'll be here with us, not just for these previews, but as the season gets a little bit closer. Dan and I are going to be kicking it into high gear.
Yes.
For that guy over there, my good friend, as always, Dan Rubenstein. Oregon grad, Dan Rubenstein for myself. Penn State grad, Ty Hildenbrand. Thanks for downloading, for listening, for playing along at home. We'll talk to you soon. Stay solid.
Peace.